The tablet hit the floor of the Lexus with a sharp plastic crack, and for one terrible fraction of a second, 8-year-old Zara Delvane went completely silent before the scream came. That sound, the sound of a little girl screaming in the backseat of a luxury SUV on the most prestigious boulevard in the state, while red and blue police lights turned the interior into a nightmare carnival, is where this story begins, because that is the moment that cannot be taken back. The moment that set everything that followed into irreversible motion. By the time the night was over, there would be 4 video recordings, a federal search warrant, a governor's direct call to the Department of Justice in Washington, and a police officer sitting in the back of a state cruiser wearing the exact expression he had put on an innocent father 40 minutes earlier. But right now, in this frozen frame, what you need to see is this Marcus Delvane, 44 years old, lead structural engineer of the largest public infrastructure contract awarded in this state. In 30 years, was pressed cheek first against the cold glass of his own car window. Hands cuffed behind his back, locked in the cage of a police cruiser while his wife Renee stood outside the Lexus with her phone raised, and her body between Officer Brett Calloway and the door behind which their children were crying. Calloway was 39 years old, 11 years on the force, a white officer who had spent more than a decade operating on a single unwritten rule that he had never once been required to defend, justify, or even acknowledge out loud because the machine around him had made sure he never had to. He had leaned into the driver's window of Marcus's car earlier that night, his belt buckle scraping the door trim the way it always did when he invaded someone's personal space. And he had looked at Marcus with the casual contempt of a man reading a parking violation, and he had said in a voice so offhand it was almost bored that a vehicle like this coming from an address like his heading to a neighborhood like this at this hour simply did not add up, that people from where Marcus came from did not typically have legitimate reasons to be on this boulevard. Those words were captured on a recording he did not know existed. They would be played in a federal courtroom 8 months later in crystal clear audio, while Calloway sat 4 feet away in a prison jumpsuit and could not find a single place in that room to look. He did not know when he hit the lights on Fairview Boulevard that night that the family in the Lexus was expected at a private dinner 3 blocks up the road at the personal estate of Governor James Whitfield, who at that exact moment was standing at his library window wondering why his guest of honor had not yet arrived. He did not know about the Ring camera on Carol Hensley's porch across the manicured lawn, or the military-grade audio system behind it, or the fact that Carol was already moving toward her front door with her phone in her hand and no intention whatsoever of going back inside. He did not know that this night was going to end. Careers trigger a federal investigation force, a legislative bill that 14 states would eventually mirror and permanently dismantle the institutional machinery that had protected men like him for longer than anyone wanted to count. He thought he was doing his job. He was catastrophically wrong. Stay with us because of what happens when that black Suburban turns the corner onto Fairview Boulevard and the rear door opens is one of the most publicly witnessed and completely irreversible acts of institutional reckoning this state has ever seen, and every single person who was ever told to just comply, just cooperate, just let it go, deserves to watch every second of it. Marcus Delvane had been driving carefully his entire adult life, and he did not mean that as a metaphor, though it was certainly that too. He meant it in the literal physical sense, the way a black man in America learns to mean it the way his father explained it to him when he was 16 and getting his driver's license sitting in the passenger seat of their family's 12-year-old Buick on a quiet Sunday afternoon. His father's voice unhurried and matter-of-fact as though he were explaining how to check the oil, which in a way he was just a different kind of maintenance, the kind that kept you alive rather than mobile. His father, Leonard Delvane, had worked 31 years for the United States Postal Service, rising to district supervisor. A man who wore his uniform with the kind of pride that does not need an audience, who drove the family Buick with both hands on the wheel at all times, not out of anxiety, but out of the same deliberate discipline he brought to everything, and who had once told Marcus that the most dangerous thing a black man could do in this country was give someone in authority a reason, Any reason, however manufactured, however thin, to decide that his excellence was actually a threat. Marcus had absorbed that lesson completely, and then he had spent the next 28 years building something so undeniable that the lesson had almost begun to feel like history rather than daily reality. He had graduated with honors from the state engineering program on a partial scholarship, the first in his family to earn a 4-year degree working 20 hours a week at a campus copy shop to cover what the scholarship did not. Sleeping 5 hours a night for 4 years without complaint, because the alternative was not sleeping 5 hours a night and not having the degree, and that was not an option he was willing to consider. He had built his firm from a 2-person office above a dry cleaner on Mercer Street into a 40-person practice with a national portfolio, and 6 months ago, after a competitive proposal process involving 8 firms with significantly larger staffs and significantly more political connections, the State Infrastructure Authority had named Marcus Delvane the lead structural engineer for the Coastal Revitalization Project, a $2.4 billion undertaking that would reshape 40 miles of coastline, create an estimated 14,000 permanent jobs, and stand as the most significant public works achievement in the state's modern history. Governor James Whitfield had championed his selection personally, publicly, and without apology, not because Marcus was black, though the governor was honest enough to acknowledge that the state had a long and documented history of awarding contracts of this magnitude to firms that looked nothing like its actual population, but because Marcus Delvane's proposal was simply, technically, and demonstrably the best one on the table, and the governor had not gotten where he was by ignoring the best option in the room. Tonight was the night the project became real in the eyes of the world. Whitfield was announcing the full project team publicly at midnight at his private estate 3 blocks up Fairview Boulevard, and Marcus had wanted his children there, for it had specifically asked Renee if they could bring Caleb and Zara because he wanted them to see what it looked like when decades of work and discipline and refusal to be diminished finally arrived at a destination worthy of all of it. He drove the Lexus at 32 miles per hour, in a 35-zone interior dome light, already on, all 4 windows cracked despite the cool evening air. Hands at 10 and 2 in the relaxed but deliberate position he had maintained on every drive through a neighborhood like this for 20 years, which was not paranoia but something closer to the practiced routine of a man who understood that the price of an unguarded moment in certain zip codes was not a fine or a delay, but something with consequences that could not be undone. In the back seat, Caleb, 11 years old, and already carrying himself with a quiet, observant seriousness that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of himself at that age, had a library book open on his lap, a thick illustrated volume about bridge engineering that he had checked out 3 weeks ago and renewed twice the pages worn soft at the corners from rereading. Zara, 8 years old and constitutionally incapable of stillness, was watching something on her tablet with her earbuds in, humming along to whatever was playing, her feet tucked under Caleb's knee, the way she always arranged herself in the back seat as if her brother were furniture placed specifically for her comfort. And Caleb had stopped objecting to this arrangement approximately 4 years ago. The Lexus had been Marcus's private milestone, a thing he had not announced or celebrated publicly, a cash purchase 3 months prior, that he had allowed himself after signing the project contract. The first luxury vehicle he had ever owned, the specific dark navy color Renee had pointed at in a showroom magazine 2 years ago, and said that's the one someday. And he had filed the image and retrieved it the morning he walked into the dealership because someday had finally arrived. He turned onto Fairview Boulevard and slowed slightly, the ancient oaks forming cathedral arches overhead, the boulevard quiet and immaculate in the way that serious old money keeps things quiet and immaculate. And he checked his mirror out of habit, and he did not see the cruiser until its lights were already on. Renee Delvane had not taken a full day off in 14 months. She was an emergency room physician at Mercy Regional Medical Center, 11 years on the floor after residency, a specialist in trauma triage who had developed a reputation among the nursing staff for 2 things: a diagnostic instinct that bordered on unsettling in its accuracy and a quality of stillness under pressure that new residents mistook for coldness until they understood that it was actually the opposite of coldness, that it was the most deliberate and practiced form of care available to a person standing in a room where the margin for error is measured in seconds rather than days. She had worked 6 consecutive 12-hour shifts before this evening, covering for a colleague whose daughter had been hospitalized, and she had done it without complaint and without fully sleeping because that was simply who Renee Delvain was. The same way the ocean is simply deep, not as an achievement, but as a nature. In the passenger seat of the Lexus tonight, she was wearing a dress she had bought 3 months ago for an occasion. She had not yet had a deep burgundy wrap dress with a single gold bracelet that had been her mother's, and she had her hair down in the way she almost never wore it outside the house because the maintenance was impractical on call days, and she had looked at herself in the mirror before they left, and felt briefly and without guilt beautiful, which was a feeling she did not always make time for, and which she intended to inhabit completely tonight. She had reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand at the last red light before Fairview Boulevard, a small gesture that carried within it 6 months of early mornings and late nights, and the specific quiet exhaustion of 2 people building something enormous while also raising 2 children and keeping a marriage genuinely alive rather than merely maintained. And Marcus had turned his palm up and held her hand for the length of the red light without either of them saying anything, because they had been together long enough to know when words were the lesser currency. The governor's dinner was not simply a celebration of Marcus's professional achievement, though it was that as well, and that alone would have been more than sufficient reason to bring the children along and let them stay up past their bedtime and watch their father shake the hand of the most powerful man in the state. The man who had stood at a press conference 6 months ago and said without hedging that the selection of Marcus Delvain's firm was the single best decision the Infrastructure Authority had made in 20 years. It was also the moment the project acquired its permanent public identity, the point at which it crossed from proposal to inevitability. And Marcus had told Renee privately in the kitchen at 11 o'clock the night before, while the children slept, that he needed Caleb and Zara in that room, not because they would fully understand what was happening at 8 and 11 years old, but because the image of it would stay in them the way certain images do, quietly shaping the architecture of what a person believes is possible for someone who looks like them, which was exactly the kind of inheritance Marcus Delvain had spent his adult life trying to build. In the back seat, Zara had fallen asleep against Caleb's shoulder, somewhere between the last traffic circle and Fairview Boulevard, her tablet gone dark in her lap, her mouth slightly open the way children sleep when they feel completely safe. And Caleb had looked down at his sister, with the particular expression of an older sibling who pretends to be inconvenienced and is secretly proud to be trusted, and had turned his page without disturbing her. The boulevard was beautiful in the way that old private wealth makes things beautiful, not showily, but completely the iron gates set back from the curb behind hedgerows that had been growing since before any of them were born. The limestone facades of the estates catching the last of the evening light, the smell of cut grass and night-blooming jasmine drifting through the cracked rear window, the absolute silence that exists in a place where nobody needs to announce themselves, because everything around them already does it for them. Marcus had been here twice before for project meetings at a contractor's residence, and each time he had felt the same precise combination of things, the pride of having arrived by merit in a space that had not historically been designed with his arrival in mind, and the discipline that kept that pride from becoming carelessness, because carelessness, his father's voice said quietly in the back of his mind, was what they were waiting for. He checked his mirror again, still clear, and adjusted his speed slightly downward. And Renee was saying something about what Caleb had told his teacher that week. Something funny and perceptive, and Marcus was beginning to smile, and then the world turned blue and red, and the sound of the siren hit the back window like a fist. Brett Calloway had been sitting in his cruiser on the side street feeding into Fairview Boulevard for 43 minutes before the Lexus turned the corner, and he had not been waiting for any particular vehicle or any particular person because he did not need to be, because the job as Calloway understood it did not require that level of specificity. What it required was the thing he had always been good at. The thing that had never been formally trained into him or formally trained out of him because the department had never found any official reason to address it. The ability to look at a situation and determine in the time it takes to draw a breath whether something was where it was supposed to be. Calloway had operated for 11 years on a single unwritten principle, one he had never articulated to a supervisor or a partner or a review board, but which governed his behavior on the street as reliably as gravity governs falling objects. And the principle was this: luxury in the wrong hands is always borrowed, taken, or fronted. And his job, his actual job, as he genuinely understood it, was to expose that pretense before it got comfortable in a neighborhood that had standards to maintain. He did not think of this as prejudice. He thought of it as pattern recognition. He had not been corrected on this point, not once in 11 years, not by a captain, not by a review board, not by the union that had quietly buried 38 complaints filed against him by people who had sat exactly where Marcus Delvane was about to sit, and the absence of correction had done what the absence of correction always does, which is to harden a behavior into a conviction and a conviction into an identity. His colleagues at the 42nd Precinct called him by a nickname used only in the break room, and only with a certain knowing tone that acknowledged both its accuracy and its danger. They called him the Taxman, because Calloway's stops in the upscale corridors of the district were so consistent, so reliably targeted, so specifically concentrated on black drivers and expensive vehicles that they read like a collection route, a toll imposed on people who had the audacity to be prosperous. Somewhere that prosperity was supposed to have a particular complexion. In 11 years, 38 people had filed complaints. Every single one had been dismissed or buried under Captain Dennis Pryor's signature. Many within 48 hours of filing in a process so swift and so consistent that it could only have been a process. A deliberate, practiced, institutional mechanism for making documentation disappear before it accumulated into a pattern that someone with authority outside the department might one day want to examine. He was parked with his lights off, engine idling, the police radio murmuring in the background with the routine administrative traffic of a Tuesday evening when the dark navy Lexus SUV turned onto Fairview Boulevard at precisely measured speed, interior dome light already illuminated, and Calloway straightened in his seat with the unhurried attention of someone who has just seen exactly what he expected to see. He ran the plate before he moved. It came back clean, registered to a Marcus Delvane at an Oak Park address, which was a respectable middle-class neighborhood 2 full districts from Fairview Heights and Calloway, noted the distance between that address and this boulevard, the way a customs agent notes a discrepancy on a form as a data point that confirmed the hypothesis rather than challenged it. Something moved in him then, something he would not have named as pleasure because he lacked the self-awareness to identify it as such, but which operated in his chest with the specific warmth of anticipated satisfaction, the hunter's readiness when the pattern presents itself exactly as expected. The quiet excitement of a man who has done this so many times that the approach itself has become the enjoyable part. The moment before the window comes down, when the power differential is at its most absolute, when the person inside the car does not yet know how the next 30 minutes are going to go, and he already does. He rolled his shoulders. He adjusted his belt with both hands, a habit so practiced it was entirely unconscious, the physical preparation of a man readying himself to occupy space that belongs to someone else. He needed a justification, and the lane departure violation was the one he used most reliably in situations like this because it required no physical evidence, no dashcam confirmation, no witness corroboration. Just his word against the drivers and the institutional mathematics of whose word carried more weight in that particular dispute had been settled long before Brett Calloway pinned on a badge. The Lexus had not drifted, had not swerved, had not crossed any line. He noted the lane departure violation in his mental report anyway, the way a man notes a calculation he has already decided the answer to and hit the lights. His body camera was on, and he had already angled his left shoulder inward slightly as he stepped out of the cruiser, a micro-adjustment so practiced it was entirely unconscious. now tilting the camera's field of view away from the angle that would have captured both his face and the driver's face, simultaneously producing instead a record that showed his shoulder the door frame and a partial view of the interior, enough to confirm he was present, not enough to reveal his expression. He had no way of knowing that across the street, built into the limestone pillar of a federal-style estate, a second camera was already recording everything. The Delvane family's response to police lights was not improvised. It was a choreography they had developed over years, not in any single conversation or formal family meeting, but through the accumulated quiet weight of 1,000 smaller conversations, a raised eyebrow between Marcus and Renee. When a cruiser lingered too long behind them at a light, a careful explanation to Caleb when he was 7 about why Daddy always turns the dome light on a bedtime discussion with Zara last year, when she asked why they practiced putting their hands where people could see them, a practice she had understood at 8 years old with a clarity that should not have been available to an 8-year-old, but was because she was paying attention in the way that children pay attention to the things that make the adults around them careful. Marcus had the dome light on before the cruiser reached a full stop behind him. All 4 windows were down, despite the cool air, the night smell of cut grass and jasmine now mixed with the exhaust and the sharp chemical scent of the spotlight burning overhead. His hands were at 10 and 2 palms flat against the wheel fingers spread. In the passenger seat, Renee had already unlocked her phone and laid it face down on her lap, with the screen recording active emotion so practiced it produced no sound and required no visible adjustment in her posture, because she had done this before in this same situation on a different road with a different officer, and she had learned from that night that the recording was the only insurance policy that did not depend on someone else's honesty. She sat rigidly upright, her burgundy dress and her mother's gold bracelet and her carefully worn-down hair all suddenly feeling like a costume in a play she had not agreed to perform, her professional composure pulling itself over her maternal terror, the way it pulled itself over everything in the ER. Not because the terror was not real, but because terror without structure is useless and she was a woman who could not afford useless. In the back seat, Zara had woken from her half-sleep when the siren burst hit the glass, and she had grabbed Caleb's arm, and Caleb had covered her hand with his and said nothing, and both of them sat with their hands visible on their laps because they knew to do that, because their parents had made sure they knew to do that. And the specific sorrow of that fact was something Marcus would return to in the months that followed at 3 a.m, when he could not sleep. Calloway's flashlight swept the back seat first. It moved with the deliberate, unhurried arc of someone conducting an inspection rather than a greeting, the beam settling on Zara's face for a full 2 seconds, long enough for the little girl to blink and turn her face slightly away, and then moving to Caleb and then to Renee before landing full and blinding on Marcus and staying there. Evening Officer Marcus said, his voice calibrated to a register of calm, cooperative professionalism that cost him more than it sounded like. "How can I help you tonight?" Calloway did not return the greeting. He stood outside the window with his flashlight pinning Marcus's eyes and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when you are being watched, long enough to establish who is waiting on whom. And then he said, "License, registration, and proof of insurance," now in the tone of a man reading instructions off a wall rather than speaking to another human being. "Of course," Marcus said, and he narrated every movement before he made it, announcing in clear, unhurried sentences that his wallet was in his back right pocket, and he was going to reach for it slowly, that the registration was in the glove compartment, and Renee was going to open it slowly, that he was handing the documents through the window now. Calloway took them without acknowledgement, held them in the flashlight beam, and Marcus watched the officer's eyes move from the license to the interior of the car, and back, the specific calculation visible in the slight narrowing at the corners, the micro pause on the Oak Park address, the way his gaze returned to the Lexus's leather interior with an expression that translated precisely in Marcus's long experience reading this particular expression as the math doesn't add up. Then Calloway leaned in. His belt buckle scraped the door trim with a small metallic sound, and he brought his face within 2 feet of Marcus's, close enough that Marcus could smell the stale coffee and peppermint gum on his breath, close enough that the lean itself was an act of dominion. and he said in the casual offhand tone of a man stating an obvious fact to someone too slow to have noticed it themselves, that a vehicle like this coming from an address like Oak Park, heading to a neighborhood like Fairview Heights at this hour of the night, simply did not add up, that people from Oak Park did not typically have legitimate reasons to be on this boulevard, and that he was going to need Marcus to help him understand what those reasons were. Renee's phone, lying face up on the door panel, now angled slightly upward toward the window, was capturing every word in the clear directional audio that the Ring camera across the street was simultaneously recording from the outside. 2 cameras running in parallel, collecting the same evidence from 2 angles, and Calloway knew about neither of them. Marcus kept his voice level and his hands visible and said that he and his family were attending a private dinner at a residence approximately 1 mile up the boulevard, and he asked politely and firmly what the stated basis for the traffic stop was, because he had not been speeding, he had not changed lanes erratically, and he was entitled under the law to know why he had been pulled over before he answered questions about his destination. Calloway's jaw tightened. He said that the vehicle matched the description of an SUV seen leaving the scene of a residential burglary 2 towns over earlier in the day, and that he had received a BOLO over dispatch, and that this constituted reasonable suspicion sufficient for a stop. Renee exhaled sharply and said quietly but clearly for the recording that they had left their home 20 minutes ago, that Marcus had not swerved once, and that a BOLO did not give an officer the right to detain a cooperative family indefinitely. Calloway pointed his finger at Renee and told her to keep quiet unless spoken to. In the back seat, Caleb whispered something to Zara too quiet to hear, and Zara pressed herself against his side and said nothing at all. Marcus's protective instinct flared in his chest like a physical thing bright and hot and almost ungovernable, and he governed it with the same discipline his father had spent 16 years teaching him to apply, and he said, "Officer, my family is in this vehicle. We are fully cooperating. There is no cause for that tone. And I am asking you again formally and on record to state the case number of the BOLO you are referencing." Calloway unsnapped the retention strap on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Marcus said with the specific, deliberate calm of a man who understands that the most dangerous thing he can do right now is show the fear he is actually feeling, that he did not believe there was a legal requirement for him to exit the vehicle during a traffic stop, particularly with minor children present and no articulable probable cause beyond an alleged BOLO for which no case number had been provided. He said it clearly without aggression in complete sentences because clarity was the only protection available to him in this moment, and he was going to deploy it until it stopped being useful or until something changed, and he was aware with the cold, analytical part of his mind that the rest of him was currently laboring to keep in the driver's seat that something was going to change soon. Calloway said, his voice dropping into the register that means the performance of authority has concluded and what remains is something rawer and more personal, that he was giving Marcus a lawful order, that Marcus was to step out of the vehicle right now, that failure to do so would result in his removal from it. Renee's hand moved on the door panel, steadying the phone's angle. "I am going to exit the vehicle," Marcus announced for the recording, and he said it loudly enough that Carol Hensley, who had reached her front porch by now and was holding her own phone toward the scene across the manicured lawn, could hear the words clearly, and he unbuckled his seatbelt with the measured patience of a man who is refusing to provide any physical data point that can be misread or recontextualized, and he opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. He was taller than Calloway by 3 inches and broader across the shoulders, and he had already consciously and deliberately rounded those shoulders slightly forward and softened his posture, making himself smaller, less geometric, less threatening. Because that was the calculation he was required to make, the calculation that his father had taught him and that he had taught himself over 28 years of being a large black man in spaces that were not designed to be comfortable with large black men. The calculation that asked, how do I make this person feel that they are in control without actually giving them anything they can use against me? He had both hands raised, palms out, when his feet touched the pavement. He had not finished saying that he was unarmed and not a threat when Calloway grabbed his left arm and spun him hard into the side of the Lexus. The impact was not subtle. Marcus's right shoulder hit the glass and his cheek hit the door frame, and the sound of it traveled through the car's body like a struck bell. And in the back seat, Zara screamed a full, terrified child scream, and Caleb's voice said, "Daddy," and then stopped, and the stopping was somehow worse than the scream. Renee was out of the passenger door before the echo had finished, and she had the phone up and she was recording, and she was saying her voice in the specific register she used when a patient was crashing, and she needed everyone in the room to hear her, that Calloway had just assaulted a compliant man in front of his children without probable cause, and that she was recording and that none of this was going to disappear. Calloway did not acknowledge her. He had Marcus's wrists pulled together behind his back, and the handcuffs went on with the practiced speed of someone who has done this movement thousands of times. The ratchet sound distinct and mechanical in the quiet boulevard air. And Marcus felt the steel bite into his skin, and he kept his voice entirely steady, and he said, "Officer Calloway, you are detaining me without probable cause. You are using excessive force against a compliant individual. You have traumatized my children, and I want you to know that I am not resisting, and I have not committed any crime." He said it for the recording. He said it for himself. He said it because he needed to hear in the open air of this beautiful street on what should have been the finest night of his professional life, his own voice refusing to be reduced to something Calloway could use. Calloway pressed him against the car, one hand between Marcus's shoulder blades, and leaned in close, his belt buckle scraping the Lexus's painted surface. This time with a small grinding sound, and in the moment before he spoke, there was something on his face that Renee captured on her phone, and that a network news anchor would describe 8 months later as the most damning 2 seconds of footage in the entire case. A look of settled, quiet satisfaction. Not the adrenaline of a dangerous situation, but the relaxed pleasure of someone doing something they enjoy. The expression of a man who has found in the exercise of absolute power over another person the specific comfort that other men find in a favorite chair at the end of a long day. And Calloway said that Marcus matched the description of a burglar, that he had been acting suspiciously, and that he was now under arrest for resisting. Marcus' cheek against the cold glass of his own car window turned his eyes and found Caleb's face looking back at him through the window from 2 feet away. And in 11 years of fatherhood, there was no moment Marcus would return to more in the months that followed than this one, his son's face, very still, very young, looking at him with the expression of a boy encountering for the first time a fact about the world that he had been told about in theory, but had hoped in the quiet and irrational way that children hope was not actually true. Marcus held his son's gaze and nodded once, a small, deliberate gesture that meant, "I am here. I am not broken. This is not the end." And then Calloway's hand was on his shoulder, steering him toward the back of the cruiser, and Marcus kept his back straight and his head up and walked. From across the lawn, Carol Hensley said loudly and clearly for her own recording that she had been watching from her window since the lights came on, and that the man against the car had not done a single thing wrong. Calloway told her to go back inside, and she said, standing on her porch in her evening clothes with her phone raised, that she would not. The interior of Brett Calloway's police cruiser smelled like stale coffee and a fast food bag that had been sitting in the footwell long enough to lose its specific identity and become simply the smell of something forgotten. And the back seat was hard-molded plastic with no padding whatsoever, designed not for the comfort of the people who sat in it, but for the ease of hosing it down afterward. And the reinforced partition between the front and back was scratched in the lower corners in ways that Marcus could not look at directly without understanding what they meant about the people who had sat here before him. He sat with his hands cuffed behind him, which forces a specific posture, a forward lean that becomes uncomfortable within minutes and painful within 15, designed whether intentionally or through institutional indifference to the question, to communicate through physical sensation the subordinate status of the person experiencing it, and Marcus was aware of this engineering the way a structural engineer cannot help being aware of the engineering of everything, could identify the load-bearing logic of the design, and kept his back as straight as the cuffs allowed because it was the one variable in this environment he could still control. The police radio in the front seat murmured its administrative traffic unit numbers and cross streets and routine confirmations, and the sound of it was oddly domestic. The background noise of a bureaucracy continuing to function while a man sat in its machinery and tried to think. Marcus thought. He was not panicking, and he was not performing calm for anyone's benefit, because there was no one watching him in here, which meant that the composure was real, which was either a testament to his discipline or to the cold clarity that occasionally arrives in the worst moments and feels less like a virtue than a neurological event, the mind reorganizing itself around the facts because it cannot afford to do otherwise. The facts were Renee's phone had been recording since before Calloway reached the window, and the recording captured the catchphrase, the belt buckle scrape against the door. Trim the demand to know Marcus's destination. The invented bolo with no case number, the instruction to keep quiet, delivered to Renee, and the sound of Marcus's body hitting the side of the Lexus. The facts were across the lawn. Carol Hensley had been recording from an angle that covered the driver's side of the Lexus in its entirety, including the approach, the lean, and the assault, and she had not gone back inside. The facts were there was no bolo. He knew there was no bolo, and the dispatch logs for the entire Tri-County area were going to confirm that there was no bolo, and those logs were not something Calloway could amend or edit or retroactively create, because dispatch logs exist on a system that is not under any individual officer's administrative control. The facts were, this was survivable. This specific night, this specific cage, this specific degradation performed on the most important evening of his professional life was survivable, and the evidence to prove what had happened already existed on 3 separate devices, and justice had a path. What was not survivable in the sense that it could not be undone or repaired or explained away to a child who would remember it for the rest of his life was Caleb's face in the window. That was the thing Marcus returned to, sitting in the hard plastic seat with his shoulders aching and the radio murmuring, and Calloway visible outside, moving toward Renee and the Lexus with the deliberate confidence of a man who expected to have his way. The image of his 11-year-old son looking at him through reinforced glass with the expression of someone encountering an ugly truth for the first time. There would be therapy. Marcus thought not as an abstract plan but as a specific commitment, forming in real time months of it. Good therapy, whatever it cost. And he was going to sit with Caleb and name this night precisely every piece of it. The ugliness and the fear and the injustice, and also the evidence and the recordings and what was going to happen next, because Caleb deserved to know that the fear was real and the truth was also real, and those two things could coexist without the fear winning. He looked through the reinforced window at the scene outside, Renee holding her ground at the Lexus door, Carol holding her position on the lawn, Calloway moving between them with the momentum of a man who has not yet realized he is out of runway. And then, from the north end of Fairview Boulevard, 2 headlights appeared and grew, and the vehicle they belonged to was large and dark and carried license plates that Marcus, even at this distance, even through scratched reinforced glass, recognized as belonging to a category of vehicle that does not travel without purpose. Something shifted in his chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but the first structural evidence that the load-bearing might, after all, be sufficient. Carol Hensley had lived on Fairview Boulevard for 22 years, long enough to know the name of every family behind every gate, the sound of every engine that belonged on this street, and the particular quality of silence that the boulevard had at 1:45 on a Tuesday when everything was as it should be. She had been standing at her bedroom window, adjusting the clasp on her necklace, getting ready to leave for a neighborhood association dinner that she had been looking forward to for 3 weeks, when the police lights came on at the south end of the boulevard and painted the underside of the oak canopy in the colors of an emergency. She had watched for 30 seconds, which was long enough. She had watched Calloway approach the Lexus, had watched the flashlight sweep the children's faces, had watched the lean into the window, his body jutting forward in that particular possessive way, his belt buckle making brief contact with the doorframe. And she had felt something rise in her chest that was not simply the alarm of a concerned neighbor, but something older and more particular. The recognition by a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children to tell the truth of a situation in which someone powerful was lying. She was 61 years old. White, a retired principal of the largest elementary school in the district, a woman whose professional life had been organized around the conviction that what happened to children in the presence of adults was the most important variable in who those children eventually became. And she had just watched a police officer sweep his flashlight across the faces of 2 children in a back seat, as a dominance display rather than a safety check. And she had put her necklace down on the dresser without finishing the clasp and walked downstairs. She came down her driveway in her going-out clothes, a cream jacket and dark slacks she had pressed that afternoon, and she reached the curb in time to watch Calloway spin Marcus into the side of the Lexus, and she raised her phone, and she pressed record, and she began narrating in the clear, unhurried carrying voice she had developed over 3 decades of addressing rooms full of 8-year-olds, naming what she was seeing as she saw it. Not editorializing, just naming the officer has slammed the driver against the vehicle. The driver's hands were raised when this occurred. The driver is now being handcuffed. Both children in the back seat are in visible distress. Calloway told her 3 times to go back inside, and each time he did it, Carol responded in the same measured, immovable register that she was standing on a public sidewalk, that she had every legal right to be there, and that she was not going anywhere. The 3rd time he told her, she stopped responding to him entirely and simply continued recording, because she had learned over 30 years that there is a kind of authority that feeds on engagement and starves without it, and she had stopped feeding it. She made eye contact with Renee across the yard. Renee still standing at the Lexus door with her phone raised and her dress and her mother's bracelet and her composure intact despite the tears that Carol could see tracking down her face in the police spotlight, and Carol gave her a single nod. The nod that says, "I see you. I am here. I am not moving." And Renee held the nod for a second and then looked back at Calloway and did not look away again. Now Calloway was moving toward Renee again, and as he crossed the lawn side of the Lexus toward the passenger door, he leaned forward in that same way, that same deliberate forward pitch from the hips that planted his physical presence in Renee's space, the way it had planted itself in Marcus's window. His belt buckle close enough to the door panel to scrape it, and he reached toward her shoulder with one hand, while the other hovered near his belt, and Carol's ring camera caught every inch of it from the driveway angle. 4 high-definition frames per second in the kind of detail that does not require interpretation. Then she heard the sound of a large vehicle turning onto the boulevard from the north end, and she adjusted her angle to include it in the frame, because whatever it was moving with the quiet, deliberate authority of something that had somewhere important to be. The black Chevrolet Suburban came down Fairview Boulevard with the unhurried certainty of a vehicle that has never in its operational life needed to hurry government plates on the front and rear windows tinted to the legal maximum in a way that simultaneously communicated privacy and consequence, its headlights cutting through the police strobes in the steady, unimpressed manner of one light source that understands it is permanently the brighter one. It did not pull up to the curb. It turned at a slight diagonal and parked across the lane in a way that boxed in Calloway's cruiser with the geometric precision of a move that someone in that vehicle had either planned or executed enough times to make instinctive. And the message of the positioning was not subtle, which was that whoever was inside had just rearranged the physical authority of this street without exiting the vehicle or saying a single word. Calloway was in the middle of reaching for Renee's shoulder to move her away from the Lexus door when the Suburban's headlights found him, and he stopped with his hand extended and turned toward the new arrival with the irritated squint of a man whose operation has been interrupted by someone who does not understand what is happening here. He assumed it was an unmarked detective unit or possibly one of the boulevard's wealthier residents who had gotten confused about what civilian vehicles were entitled to do at an active scene, and he was already formulating the command to move the vehicle when both front doors opened simultaneously. The two men who stepped out moved in a way that resolved Calloway's confusion without actually answering it, because the synchronized, scanning, economical quality of their movement communicated a professional category that was neither local detective nor wealthy resident, a category that existed at a different altitude from anything on Calloway's organizational chart, and his formulated command died in his throat. Agent Ramon Torres, lead security detail, was on the driver's side, and he placed himself between Calloway and the Suburban's rear door, with one hand near his lapel, and his eyes moving across the scene with the rapid, methodical inventory of someone who has been trained to assess threat and asset simultaneously. And he said, in the flat, unhurried tone of a man who is not accustomed to repeating himself, "Officer, step back, please." Calloway puffed up. He said that this was an active police scene and that the agent needed to identify himself and move the vehicle. Torres said, "Officer, step back," the same words in the same tone, quieter this time, which was somehow more effective than if he had raised his voice, because raising your voice is what people do when they are not certain they will be obeyed, and Torres was absolutely certain. Calloway's hand moved toward his radio. Torres said, "I would not do that." And then the rear door of the Suburban opened. What stepped out first was a charcoal suit jacket, fine wool without a tie, worn with the ease of a man for whom dressing well is a habit rather than an effort. Then silver cufflinks catching the police strobes for a half-second flash. Then posture, the upright, settled bearing of a man who has spent decades in rooms where being looked at was part of the work, and has long since stopped performing anything for the looking a man who carries his own gravity rather than borrowing it from his surroundings. He did not look at Calloway. He looked at the Lexus, and he took in Renee at the door with her phone raised and her face wet, and he looked at the children visible in the back seat, and then he looked at the cruiser parked at the angle that caged Marcus inside it, and the looking took approximately 4 seconds, and was entirely silent. And the expression that settled over his features during those 4 seconds was not anger in the performed vocal sense, but in the contained, deeply cold sense of a man who has just seen something he will not allow to stand. Then he looked at Calloway. And Calloway, who was still processing the suit and the cufflinks and the security detail and the government plates and the particular quality of attention being directed at him from 18 feet away, had not yet arrived at the recognition. And so he said, with the last of his residual authority, that whoever this was needed to identify himself and step back from the active scene. Governor James Whitfield walked toward him anyway. He covered the 18 feet in the same measured, unhurried stride with which he crossed every room he had ever entered, and he stopped 6 feet from Calloway and looked at him with the steady, unblinking regard of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the record to catch up. And Calloway looked back at him, and the recognition arrived. The recognition did not arrive all at once. It moved through Calloway in layers, the way a structural failure moves through a building, beginning at the stress point and spreading outward, and the audience can track it in the sequence of what his body did in the 3 seconds between the moment the governor stopped 6 feet away and the moment Calloway took his involuntary step backward. First, his mouth stopped working mid-sentence, the word he was producing simply ceasing as if the electrical signal that drove speech had been interrupted by a competing frequency. Second, the color left his face, beginning at the jaw, moving upward across the cheeks and into the forehead in a wave that the ring camera across the street captured in the kind of unflinching, high-definition detail that makes video evidence indistinguishable from confession. Third, his right hand, which had been resting on his service weapon with the practiced ease of 11 years of muscle memory, went slack, the fingers spreading away from the grip rather than tightening around it. The opposite of every training scenario he had ever run, the involuntary physical response of a body that has just been confronted with information that overrides the trained response entirely. Fourth, his boot heel caught the curb edge as he took the backward step, and he stumbled slightly, barely just enough to break the physical authority he had been projecting since he walked up to the Lexus, just enough for everyone watching Carol on her lawn, and Renee at the door, and Agent Torres and the 2 state troopers, now pulling up quietly at the far end of the boulevard to see the architecture of his confidence crack from the foundation upward. In the half-second of the recognition, Calloway's mind produced an image he had not thought about in 4 months, an image from a mandatory department briefing in which Captain Pryor had displayed a presentation slide about Governor Whitfield's new civil rights enforcement initiative, and Calloway had been in the back row with his partner, and he had leaned over and said in the specific low register of a man who has never been genuinely threatened by an authority, "He cannot see that governors don't scare him, that politicians live in a different world, and their initiatives were for press releases and election cycles, and not for the street." And his partner had smirked, and they had both turned back to the presentation, with the settled indifference of men who have been protected long enough to confuse protection with immunity. That sentence detonated in his chest now with the particular humiliating precision of a prediction made in hubris arriving to be corrected in public. Governor James Whitfield stopped and held Calloway's gaze without blinking, without performing, without raising his voice, which was its own kind of authority. The kind that does not need volume because it has never needed volume. The kind built over decades of decisions made in rooms where the wrong choice had real consequences for real people and the right choice was not always the easy one. He was 64 years old, a 2-term governor who had built his career specifically on the ground that Calloway had just poisoned civil rights enforcement and institutional accountability, and the specific patient grinding work of dismantling the machinery that allowed men like Calloway to operate without consequence for 11 years. And the fury on his face was not the hot, reactive fury of someone caught off guard, but the cold, deliberate fury of a man who has been working toward a moment like this for his entire political life, and is now watching it materialize in his own neighborhood on the night he was supposed to be celebrating the best thing his administration had done. He named Marcus. He said it clearly for the recording for the troopers pulling up at the end of the boulevard for Carol's camera and for Calloway Marcus Delvane, the lead structural engineer of the state's coastal revitalization project. His personal friend, the guest of honor at a dinner he was hosting. 3 blocks up this road was currently sitting in the back of Calloway's cruiser, and Calloway had put him there without a single piece of legitimate probable cause. And the bolo that Calloway had cited did not exist in any dispatch log in the Tri-County area. And Whitfield knew this because he read the morning briefings, and he knew every dispatch record in his district. And he had not lived 3 blocks from this boulevard for 12 years without knowing the difference between a legitimate police action and a man with a badge doing what he had always done on this street with complete confidence that the system around him would make it disappear. Calloway tried to speak 3 times. The first attempt produced a fragment of a sentence that included the word governor and then stopped. The second produced the word vehicle and then stopped. The third produced nothing. From inside the cruiser, Marcus watched the exchange through the reinforced glass, and he watched Calloway's body language execute its complete reversal in real time. The puff of the chest deflating the shoulders, pulling inward, the hand off the weapon, the backward stumble. And he felt something that was not satisfaction exactly, because satisfaction implies a lightness, and what he felt was heavier than that. The specific, complicated weight of being right about the danger you were in, and having it confirmed by the arrival of someone powerful enough to stop it, which is a relief so profound it can only be distinguished from grief by the direction it moves. Whitfield turned to Agent Torres and said, without looking away from Calloway, "Get Mr. Delvane out of that vehicle and get the state police superintendent on the phone." Torres moved to the cruiser. The door opened. Marcus stepped out into the cool evening air, and he straightened slowly, rolling his wrists as much as the cuffs allowed, and he looked through the Lexus window at his children. And Caleb was watching him with Zara's hand held in both of his. And Marcus nodded, and this time the nod meant something different than it had meant when he was pressed against the glass. This time it meant it is moving in the right direction. "Now hold on, I am coming." Captain Dennis Pryor arrived in an unmarked Ford Explorer tires, announcing him before he did. pulling to the curb with the urgency of a man who has received a phone call that made his stomach drop and has been rehearsing his management strategy for the entire drive over. He was 52 years old, 20 years in the department. A man who had built a career not on any particular excellence in police work, but on the specific, cultivated talent of making problems smaller before they became public record. A talent that had served him well for 2 decades, and that was on this particular stretch of Fairview Boulevard spectacularly failing to activate. He took in the scene in a single sweep. The Suburban with government plates, the 2 suits. The troopers at the end of the boulevard Calloway, standing with his hand off his weapon and his face the color of old concrete. And then Governor Whitfield, and in the millisecond between seeing the governor and beginning to speak, Pryor made the calculation that Pryor always made, which was that whatever had happened here could still be shaped if he moved fast enough and spoke confidently enough and kept his explanations in the bureaucratic register that made everything sound like a process rather than a choice. He extended his hand toward the governor and said with the projected concern of a man performing accountability for an audience he believes he can manage, that there had clearly been some kind of misunderstanding that Officer Calloway was one of the department's most proactive patrolmen, that the department had received a legitimate bolo and tensions in the district had been elevated, and that he personally assured the governor that this would be handled internally with the full rigor of departmental review. Whitfield looked in the extended hand for 2 full seconds without taking it. Then he looked at Pryor. He said, "Agent Torres, what did the dispatch log show?" Torres produced the tablet from his jacket and read from it without theatrics or elaboration, which was worse than theatrics, because it removed every variable except the fact itself. No bolo for any dark SUV in the Tri-County area. In the past 12 hours, no reported residential burglary matching any description in the Tri-County area in the past 12 hours, and the only radio traffic from Officer Calloway this evening was a call for backup in which he described a suspect as non-compliant. Pryor's hand was still slightly extended. He lowered it. Whitfield turned to him and said in the quiet, specific register of a man who has stopped performing patience that Pryor was going to walk over to where Calloway was standing and that Calloway was going to surrender his badge, his service weapon, and his radio, and that Calloway was going to be transported not to the 42nd Precinct, but to the State Police Barracks at Troop D, where he would be formally interviewed by the Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, and that Pryor's department was relieved of jurisdiction over this incident as of this moment. Pryor said that the governor could not unilaterally strip his department of jurisdiction over an active stop, that there were union protocols, that Calloway had rights, that the governor was putting himself in a difficult position legally. Whitfield took a step toward him. He said with the clarity of a man who has no remaining interest in managing this. Gently, he was the chief executive of this state. He had personally witnessed an aggravated assault committed under color of law against a compliant citizen. There were 4 active recordings of the assault currently in existence. And if Pryor said the word protocol to him one more time while 2 children sat traumatized in a back seat 30 feet away, he would ensure that Pryor was standing in front of a federal camera by sunrise. Pryor went to Calloway. The exchange was brief and quiet, and witnessed by Carol from her lawn and by Renee from her position at the Lexus, and by the troopers who had moved up from the end of the boulevard, and it was witnessed by Marcus, standing free on the pavement now rubbing his wrists where the steel had bitten in, watching through the evening air, as the man who had caged him surrendered the apparatus of his authority one piece at a time. Calloway's hands shook badly enough when he removed the gun belt that the service weapon fell to the asphalt with a sound that carried across the quiet boulevard, and made Carol flinch, and made Renee close her eyes for a second, and a trooper stepped forward and retrieved it without looking at Calloway. And that was somehow the most complete articulation of what Calloway had become in the space of 40 minutes, a man whose weapon required another man to pick up off the ground. The state cruiser door closed behind Calloway, and the sound it made was final. Whitfield crossed to Marcus and Renee, and he apologized to both of them in full sentences without hedging or qualification. Not the performed apology of a politician, but the genuine contrition of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and did not want to minimize it with efficient language. Renee received the apology with her spine straight and her voice steady, and said 3 sentences that Whitfield would carry with him into every legislative meeting that followed. That her children had practiced putting their hands where a stranger could see them since they were old enough to follow instructions, that she had spent tonight hoping that practice would be enough, and that she was grateful the governor had arrived, and deeply, profoundly exhausted that his arrival was the thing that had made the difference. In the back seat of the Lexus, Zara reached up and took Caleb's hand, and for the first time since the lights came on, neither of them pulled away. The gates of Governor Whitfield's Fairview Heights estate closed behind the Delvane family's Lexus at 12:47 in the morning, and the sound of them closing was the first moment since the police lights came on that Marcus allowed his shoulders to drop. The estate was large but not ostentatious, the kind of property that signals its seriousness through restraint, rather than display a federal-style main house in pale limestone, with deep-set windows and a circular drive bordered by mature boxwood hedges that had been growing since before most of the state's current leadership was born. The lights inside warm and amber at this hour. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking coming through half-open French doors. The faint sound of music from the dining room that had apparently been playing for 3 hours waiting for guests who had been otherwise detained. A staff member met them at the door with towels and water, and the unobtrusive efficiency of someone trained to anticipate needs rather than respond to crises. And Zara, who had been silent in the back seat for the entire drive, looked around the entrance hall with the wide, dazed eyes of a child trying to recalibrate where she was, and Renee kept one hand on her daughter's shoulder and one arm around Caleb's and steered them toward the private sitting room that had been prepared on the east wing. A medic arrived within 5 minutes. Quiet professional, asking only the questions that needed asking, and he documented the abrasions on Marcus's wrists with a digital camera in the clinical, unhurried manner of someone who understood that this documentation was going to matter, and he treated the skin with the specific attention of a person who takes seriously that a man's wrists had been bound against his will, and that the physical record of that fact belonged to its history. Zara fell asleep on a throw-covered settee with her shoes still on, within 30 minutes of arriving, the particular crashing sleep of a child whose nervous system has been pushed past its capacity and has simply taken the decision out of her hands. And Renee sat beside her with one hand resting on her back and watched her breathe. And Marcus stood in the doorway of the sitting room for a long moment, watching both of them before he went to the library. Caleb did not sleep. He sat in a chair near the window of the sitting room and answered his mother's questions in the careful, measured sentences of an 11-year-old who is trying to be older than he is because he understands on some level that he cannot fully articulate that tonight needs something from him. And when Renee told him that everything that happened tonight was wrong, that his father had done nothing wrong, that the officer's behavior was not how things were supposed to work, Caleb looked at her for a moment and said, with the flat, precise delivery of a child, encountering a truth that has not yet been softened by the passage of time, "I know, Mom. I know it wasn't how it's supposed to work. I just didn't know it would actually happen to us." Renee did not have an immediate answer for that, and she did not pretend to, because she was his mother and she was an emergency physician, and she understood that the most harmful thing she could do right now was offer him a reassurance that tonight did not earn. In the library, Governor Whitfield sat across a mahogany table from Marcus and looked at him without the managed composure of a politician, and with the direct, unmediated expression of a man who is genuinely angry about something and is not going to dress that anger up as anything else. And he said that this would not be resolved quietly, that the quiet resolution was exactly the mechanism that had allowed 38 prior complaints to disappear under Pryor's signature, and that what happened tonight was going to be used to dismantle that mechanism rather than feed it. Diana Voss came into the library with a laptop under her arm and a legal pad that was already half filled with her small, precise handwriting, and she sat down without preamble and said that she had been reviewing the recordings for the past 45 minutes, and that the case at the federal level was not complicated, and that the complication was not going to come from the law but from the union, which would be operational within hours, and that they needed to be ready for it before the sun came up. She opened the laptop. On the screen was the beginning of a press release that was going to be, as of the following morning, the most read document in the state. Frank Harlan received the call from Pryor at 1:15 in the morning and took it in his kitchen in his shirt sleeves, eating a cold sandwich that he had made for himself 3 hours ago and forgotten about because Frank Harlan was a man with too many things to manage and a chronic inability to stop managing them long enough to eat a warm meal. He was 57 years old, a former officer himself, the president of the local police union. For 11 years, a compact, barrel-chested man who moved through every room as if he were ready to be challenged in it, whose default expression was the specific variety of preemptive irritation worn by people who have been arguing their position for so long that they have forgotten they could stop, who kept a framed photograph of himself shaking the hand of a former police commissioner on the wall behind his desk, and who straightened it unconsciously every single morning when he sat down, which was a gesture that told you everything you needed to know about Frank Harlan's relationship with the idea of institutional legitimacy. He did not think of himself as someone who protected bad cops. He thought of himself as someone who protected the institution, and the institution as he understood it had no mechanism for distinguishing between the protection owed to a good officer unjustly accused and the protection owed to a bad officer justly accused, because the union was not a court, and it was not his job to adjudicate guilt, and the moment it started adjudicating guilt, it would stop functioning as a union, which was a logical argument that happened also to be extraordinarily convenient for the 38 people who had filed complaints and been quietly ignored. Pryor gave him a version of the night's events that was shaped unconsciously but decisively by Pryor's terror of what the full version would do to his own future. And so, what Harlan received was an account in which a well-connected individual had used political relationships to have a dedicated officer suspended following a routine and legally conducted traffic stop, and in which the media was likely to be involved by morning, and in which the union needed to establish a public narrative before the other side could. Pryor did not tell Harlan that Governor Whitfield had been present on the boulevard. He did not tell Harlan about Carol Hensley's ring camera system or its military-grade audio capabilities. He did not tell Harlan that Renee Delvane had been recording from inside the car since before Calloway reached the window. He told Harlan what he could manage, which was far less than what existed, and Harlan built his strategy on the information he had, which is to say that Harlan built his strategy on a foundation that was going to be publicly detonated in less than 12 hours. The press conference was scheduled for 7 in the morning. Harlan stood behind a podium on the steps of the Union building, wearing a suit he had pulled from his closet at 5 a.m., and he deployed the specific aggressive righteous public register he had developed over 11 years of defending indefensible positions with enough volume and manufactured conviction that the institutions around him had generally decided it was easier to manage him than to confront him. He named Marcus Delvane publicly. He described him as politically connected and aggressive and uncooperative. A man who had used elite relationships to victimize a dedicated officer who had physically endangered Officer Calloway during a routine stop, who had then leveraged those relationships to bypass standard departmental review in a way that constituted, in Harlan's characterization, a grotesque abuse of privilege. He demanded Calloway's immediate reinstatement. He announced a civil suit against Marcus personally. In the library of the governor's estate, the Delvane family watched this on a flat-screen television with the particular quality of attention that people bring to watching themselves be lied about in public. And Marcus's jaw tightened with a visible controlled force, and Caleb, who had finally been brought into the library because Renee thought he was old enough to see this, watched the screen with the focused expression of someone assembling information into a category and said nothing. Renee set down her coffee cup with careful, deliberate calm. The motion of a woman who understands that the cup is not the problem and that the problem has a solution, but that the solution requires her to remain functional. Diana Voss had allowed herself during the press conference a single slow smile that did not reach the warm end of the smile spectrum, but communicated with professional precision the expression of a woman watching someone walk into exactly the trap she has prepared for them. She turned the television off. She said he just built his entire public position on 4 statements that our recordings disprove in under 90 seconds each. She opened her laptop. She said, "Let's go." At 10:47 in the morning, Diana Voss hit send. The email went to 34 recipients, simultaneously network news producers, investigative journalists at the 3 largest print outlets in the state, digital media, editors with established national audiences, and 2 documentary journalists who had been covering police accountability stories for the past 6 years, and whose contact information Voss maintained in a dedicated folder she had not needed to open in 8 months. The subject line was 17 words: Governor's Office releases unedited footage disproving police union's account of Fairview Boulevard stop. Attached to the email were 3 video files, unedited, uncompressed in the highest resolution available. Renee's phone recording from inside the Lexus, Carol Hensley's Ring camera footage from across the lawn, and Agent Torres's body camera from the Suburban, which had been running from the moment Torres exited the vehicle and captured the governor's entire interaction with Calloway in a single unbroken take. The detonation was instantaneous. Within 8 minutes, WOAK4 interrupted a mid-morning talk program to go live. Within 11 minutes, the state's largest digital news platform had embedded all 3 videos and posted a headline that would be shared nearly 250,000 times before midnight. But the specific visual that broke the story opened the image that would still be used in journalism ethics courses 3 years later, was the split screen that 3 separate networks adopted simultaneously and independently. A format that required no narration because the juxtaposition was its own argument on the left side of the screen. Frank Harlan at his podium from 2 hours earlier describing Marcus Delvane as physically aggressive and uncooperative. On the right side, Renee's phone recording of Marcus narrating every movement before making it his hands raised when he exited the vehicle, his voice level and deliberate and completely, undeniably compliant, and then Calloway spinning him into the side of his own car. Social media ignition was not metaphorical, but structural. The kind of rapid cascading engagement that platform algorithms are specifically designed to amplify. And within 90 minutes, the story was not a regional news event, but a national one. And within 3 hours, it had reached the particular velocity at which things stop being stories and become cultural reference points. The specific moment that went most broadly viral was not the assault footage, though, that was shared extensively, but something smaller and more human. Carol Hensley on her front lawn in her cream jacket and her pressed dark slacks phone, raised voice carrying in the clear boulevard air, refusing to go back inside the image of an older white woman in evening clothes standing on a manicured lawn and holding her ground against a uniformed officer who kept ordering her off it. An image that people across the political spectrum found legible in their own terms, and which generated in the comment sections of 100 different platforms an unusual volume of messages from older men and women who said versions of the same thing. I know what it cost her to stand there, and I know what it would have cost to go back inside. The second detonation came at 12:38 when a network audio engineering team cleaned and amplified the Ring camera recording from Carol's system and isolated the audio from the moment Calloway leaned into the driver's window and played it clearly and in its entirety on national television for the first time. The casual contempt of it, the offhand conversational tone in which Calloway had said what he said to Marcus about a vehicle like this, and an address like his, and a neighborhood like this, and what that combination did and did not add up to, was in some ways more effective as evidence than the assault footage, because the assault footage showed one terrible moment, and the audio showed the reasoning behind it. The philosophy made audible, the 11 years of unchallenged conviction compressed into a sentence spoken to a man's face with the confidence of someone who had always been allowed to say it. Harlan's office had gone dark. Phones unanswered. Public communications suspended the union's social media accounts abruptly silent, a silence more communicative than anything they might have said. Pryor had locked his office door and was not responding to calls from the mayor's office. the city council liaison, or reportedly his own deputy captain. The narrative they had relied on the settled assumption that the account of a white officer with 11 years of departmental backing would carry more institutional weight than the account of a black family in a luxury vehicle had not just failed, but had failed in public in high definition in real time in front of 34 journalists who had been given everything they needed to make the failure permanent. The two men arrived at Carol Hensley's estate at 11:43 that night, and they came in a vehicle with no identifying markings and parked half a block down the boulevard so that the streetlights fell at an angle that did not illuminate the license plate, which was a level of operational awareness that Carol, watching from her upstairs window when she heard the car door, noted with the particular quiet attention of a woman who has been a principal long enough to recognize when someone is trying to avoid accountability. They were large men in inexpensive suits, and they walked up her driveway with the specific, deliberate quality of people who are accustomed to their physical presence being sufficient argument, and they positioned themselves on her mahogany porch in a way that blocked the view of the front door from the street, which was, Carol understood immediately, not an accident. They did not identify themselves as law enforcement, which she also noted. The one who spoke first had his hand resting inside his jacket, in the way that is designed to imply what it does not technically state, and he spoke with the careful diction of someone delivering a script they have rehearsed enough to present as extemporaneous. And he said that Carol had extensive catering contracts with the city's municipal events office and that those contracts were potentially subject to review under a provision of the city's vendor ethics ordinance that he mentioned could trigger a protracted federal fraud investigation if a formal complaint were filed, and that this kind of thing was terribly disruptive for a small business owner, and he would hate to see it happen to someone with her standing in the community. He said that what they needed was simple a one-page signed affidavit witnessed and notarized, stating that the audio and lighting of Carol's ring camera footage had been edited to misrepresent the behavior of Officer Calloway, specifically that the audio had been manipulated to make his statements sound more aggressive than they were in the original recording. Just a piece of paper, he said. Just a correction. Carol stood in her dark foyer with her phone in her right hand, and her heart moving faster than she would have liked because she was 61 years old and alone in her house, and the men on her porch were large and clearly practiced in the art of standing in a way that communicated options without articulating them. And she was frightened in the specific, practical way of a woman who takes threats seriously rather than dismissing them. But she had taught 8th graders for 30 years, and what 30 years of 8th graders teaches you more than any other single lesson is the precise and exhaustive taxonomy of what a bully looks like when he is bluffing. What these two men did not know, because they had not done sufficient research on Carol Hensley before arriving at her door with their script and their implied menace, was that her late husband had been a defense systems contractor who had spent 22 years working on military-grade surveillance and security architecture, and who had 12 years ago installed in and around their estate a security system that he had described to Carol at the time as several generations ahead of anything available commercially, and which captured everything within 40 feet of the property in 4K resolution from 6 independent camera angles with directional noise-canceling audio that could distinguish individual voices in moderate wind at 25 feet. Every word they had spoken since their shoes touched the driveway was on record. Carol pressed the button on her phone that she had set up that afternoon at Diana Voss's request, a single action that encrypted the security system's captured file and forwarded it automatically to Voss's secure legal server, and she heard in her earpiece the small confirmation chime that indicated the transfer was complete. Then she spoke through the intercom. She used the voice she had used in hallways and classrooms and parent meetings for 3 decades, the voice that was not loud, but that carried in the specific way that voices carry when they are backed by absolute conviction. And she said that both men were currently being recorded by a security system that had been running since they turned onto her driveway, that the recording was already transmitted to the governor's legal team, and that they had a choice between leaving her property in the next 10 seconds or being reported to the state police for criminal intimidation of a witness in a federal investigation, and that she would not be asking again. The silence on the porch lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the sound of 2 sets of feet moving quickly and a car starting half a block away and tires on the night-damp asphalt. Carol sat down in a chair in the foyer and let out a very long, very slow breath, and then she called Diana Voss. Voss answered on the first ring. Carol said they came. Voss said, "I know. I have it. Every word." And then, after a pause, Carol, "This is witness tampering on 4 independent camera angles. This is the last thing these people should have done." She was already dialing the governor's private line when she said it. The 12 Suburbans arrived at the 42nd Precinct at 9:15 in the morning without announcement, without press release, without the advance courtesy call that the department's leadership had been trained over 2 decades of soft accountability to expect before any serious oversight arrived at their door. They came in a convoy that occupied the full length of the precinct's front approach and parked with the methodical, unhurried efficiency of a team that has done this enough times to have a protocol for it. And the 2 desk sergeants on morning watch men who had between them 40 years of experience, reading the arrival of authority and calibrating their response accordingly, looked at the Navy windbreakers and the yellow letters and the equipment cases coming through the front door, and made the specific instantaneous assessment that this was not a situation that their usual calibrations were going to be useful in. Special Agent Marcus Webb led the team through the precinct's front entrance with the flat-footed, even stride of a man who does not accelerate, because he does not need to, because the authority he is carrying arrived before he did, and he walked through the main floor of the building with his eyes moving across the space in the practiced sweep of someone inventorying what is present and what is missing, and he went directly to the staircase and up to the 2nd floor without stopping at the front desk to ask where anything was because his team had floor plans. He opened Captain Pryor's office door without knocking. Pryor was on the phone, and Webb stood in the doorway and waited for Pryor to look up, which took 4 seconds. And when Pryor looked up, Webb held up 2 fingers and said, "Hang up the phone, Captain." And Pryor looked at the windbreaker and the letters on it and the expression on Webb's face and hung up the phone. Webb placed a federal search warrant on the desk with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who understands that this document is a historical artifact and treats it accordingly. He said, "Captain Pryor, this department is under federal investigation for coordinated conspiracy to violate the civil rights of Marcus Delvane, aggravated assault under color of law, fabricated probable cause, and witness tampering in the person of Carol Hensley. You are not under arrest at this time. That may change. Step away from your computer." Pryor's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions. Outrage, calculation, and something that landed in the vicinity of fear, and he said, with the institutional vocabulary of a man reaching for the handle he has always been able to grab, that this was an outrage, that Webb had no jurisdiction here, that they were conducting an internal affairs review, and the DOJ had no basis to supersede that process. Webb said, "Your Internal Affairs Division has signed off on 38 excessive force complaints in 11 years, 27 of them. Involving black motorists in upscale corridors at a dismissal rate and dismissal speed that is statistically consistent with a process designed to eliminate complaints rather than review them. That is not an internal affairs process. That is an obstruction architecture. We are here to document it." He nodded to the team behind him, and forensic accountants and cyber agents moved into the space with their equipment cases and their clipboards, and they began the methodical, irreversible process of opening everything that had been closed, pulling physical files from filing cabinets and stacking them in labeled boxes, cloning hard drives in place without moving them from the desks they sat on, photographing document storage areas with timestamp embedded cameras that would make every image admissible. Webb's team opened Calloway's internal affairs file within the first 2 hours. The file was not hidden. It was precisely where it was supposed to be filed and labeled and maintained in a format that was officially compliant and operationally protective. 38 complaint forms in chronological order, each one accompanied by a dismissal letter on department letterhead bearing Pryor's signature. The language of the dismissal letters so uniform across 11 years and 38 cases that the FBI's document analysis team would later determine that at least 22 of the letters had been produced from the same template, modified only in the names of the complainants and the dates, a degree of administrative standardization in the disposal of civil rights complaints that suggested not a case-by-case review, but a production line. Webb sat with the file open on the desk in front of him and read it for 40 minutes without speaking to anyone. When he closed it, he called Governor Whitfield directly. He said, "We have everything we need, and then some." The stories inside Calloway's internal affairs file were not individually dramatic. They did not read like the climactic scenes of stories. They read like the middle passages, the parts where nothing decisive has happened yet, and the situation is still open, and the person writing it down still believes that the act of writing it down is the thing that will make the difference. A 41-year-old software engineer who had been pulled over on Fairview Boulevard 3 years earlier, driving a company vehicle, who had filed a detailed complaint about the flashlight in his eyes, and the bolo that turned out not to exist, and the handcuffs, and the search of his vehicle without consent, and who had received a dismissal letter 7 days later saying that the review had determined Officer Calloway's conduct to be within departmental guidelines. A 38-year-old woman, a hospital administrator, who had been stopped twice in 6 months in the same corridor by the same officer in different vehicles, and who had filed 2 complaints and received 2 dismissal letters, the second one arriving 41 hours after submission. A 52-year-old man, a retired high school principal who had moved to the district 2 years prior and who had written 6 pages describing in precise and measured language the experience of being told by Calloway that his address didn't match the neighborhood he was driving through, and who had received a form letter in response. Each complaint was a complete human account of something that had been absorbed by the institutional machinery and neutralized without review, fed into the front of the process, and returned from the back as a dismissal letter that bore the official imprimatur of due diligence. Without the substance of it, 38 acts of bureaucratic disappearance performed so smoothly that the only way to see them as a pattern, rather than a series of individual decisions, was to put them all in a file and read them in sequence, which was exactly what the FBI was now doing. The financial forensics uncovered the Kroll Associates payments within the first 48 hours. The union's disbursement records, subpoenaed and delivered electronically, showed 17 payments to Kroll Associates over the past 8 months, totaling just over $90,000, classified in the union's accounting as consultancy fees for a contractor whose incorporation records listed no physical address, no employees, and no client history outside the local police union. The 2 men who had appeared on Carol's porch were identified from her security footage within 72 hours, their faces cross-referenced against contractor databases, and both of them, independently and without consulting each other, said that Frank Harlan had authorized the visit. Calloway was brought to the federal field office for formal interview on the 3rd day. He arrived in civilian clothes without union counsel, and the transformation in his physical presentation was complete enough that the agents who had reviewed his arrest footage from Fairview Boulevard and then saw him in the interview room had a brief disorienting experience of being uncertain. It was the same person, not because he looked so different in any single feature, but because the thing that had animated him on the boulevard, the proprietary ease, the settled confidence of a man occupying a space he believes he owns, was entirely gone, replaced by the particular stillness of someone who has had every external structure of his identity stripped away in 72 hours and has not yet found anything underneath it. He was driven back to the extended stay motel where he had been living since his wife asked him to leave the family home 4 days after the Fairview Boulevard footage went national, and he sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. The machine did not fall all at once. It fell the way the things that have been structurally compromised for a long time tend to fall, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a sequence of smaller failures that each make the next one more likely, each load-bearing element transferring its weight to the next, until the accumulated stress exceeds what any single remaining element can bear. The mayor's office moved first, which was the political calculation of a man who understood that the window between visible federal action and personal accountability was narrow and closing, and who made his calculation accordingly, Pryor was terminated within 72 hours of the FBI's arrival, his pension frozen pending the outcome of the federal review, and a statement was issued from the mayor's office that managed the specific rhetorical challenge of expressing institutional outrage about something the institution had been tolerating for 11 years. The union's national board reviewed the federal charging documents and reached their conclusion with the speed of an organization that has been in legal trouble before and knows the difference between a situation it can manage and a situation that will spread if it is not immediately amputated. And they called Frank Harlan and told him in the language of men who are not interested in discussion that he was going to resign or be removed, and that the difference between those two things was primarily a matter of how the announcement was framed, not of what happened afterward. Harlan resigned. The statement his office released cited health reasons and a desire to spend more time with family language that has the distinction of being both entirely standard and entirely dishonest, in a way that the people who need to understand it always understand perfectly. The union abandoned Callaway completely, which was the most consequential single action in the sequence, because it removed the institutional armor that had made his behavior possible for 11 years, and without it, he was simply a man facing the federal government with a public defender and a file documenting 38 complaints and a ring camera recording of him leaning into the driver's window of a Lexus and saying something that a network audio engineering team had cleaned and amplified and distributed to 34 journalists. Marcus sat with his family in the living room of their Oak Park home on the evening the union's national statement was released. Zara curled in his lap with her tablet. Caleb at the desk doing homework with the focused, deliberate energy of a boy who had decided that the homework was something he could control and was therefore going to be done perfectly. Renee in the chair across from him with a medical journal in her lap that she was not reading, and the television was off and had been off for most of the past week, because Marcus had made a quiet family decision that the news cycle was not going to be the dominant soundtrack of his children's recovery. He looked at Zara, who was watching something on her tablet with her earbuds in her feet tucked under Caleb's knee, the way they always were. And he thought about the woman at the complaint desk 11 years ago who had taken the software engineer's 6-page account and fed it into the machine, and the machine had returned a form letter, and the software engineer had taken the form letter home and put it in a folder, and lived with what that meant, and nobody had driven by. He did not say any of this out loud. He kept it in the place where certain things live. The place that is not silence exactly, but that is adjacent to it. The place where a person stores the facts about the world that they have decided to carry, rather than put down. Because putting them down entirely is not an option, and carrying them openly is a weight you cannot afford if you also need to be present for 2 children who are still learning what the world actually is. 8 months had the quality of a long time and also of an instant, depending on which part of the Delvane family you were asking. For Zara, 8 months had been 3 months of nightmares, a gradual return to sleeping through the night, 6 weeks of refusing to get in the car after dark before Renee found the right therapist, and then slowly the renegotiation of what felt safe. A process that was ongoing and non-linear, and that her therapist described in the careful, honest language of someone who does not promise timelines as work that will continue for some years, but that is clearly and measurably progressing. For Caleb, 8 months had been a research project on police accountability legislation that his social studies teacher had not assigned, but that Caleb had begun and completed on his own, and presented to the class in the measured, precise diction of a boy who has decided that understanding the structure of a problem is the first prerequisite for contributing to its solution. For Marcus, 8 months had been the completion of the first major phase of the Coastal Revitalization Project, 112 meetings with contractors and engineers and city planners. The satisfying grounding work of building something real and permanent, and underneath all of it, the constant unresolved awareness of the 38 names in Callaway's file and the question of what this trial meant for them, even though none of them were sitting at the plaintiff's table. The United States District Court building was limestone and marble, and the specific quality of federal grandeur that communicates permanence rather than power, as if the building itself is trying to suggest that the institution inside it is not about any individual, but about something that survives individuals. A suggestion Marcus had always found simultaneously reassuring and, given the file he had read, deeply ironic. The gallery was full in the specific way of a proceeding that has become more than a trial, the rows occupied by journalists and civil rights advocates and families who had driven in from 3 counties because they needed to be present for this, in the way that certain events require physical presence to be real. And Marcus was aware of them the way a person is aware of a crowd that has gathered around something that is also happening to them personally, the presence both grounding and strange. The air in the courtroom was cool and slightly over-conditioned, the way federal buildings always manage their climate, as if comfort is too casual a word for what they are trying to provide. And it carried the smell of old wood and floor wax and the particular dry quality of recycled air in a room that has held a lot of human emotion over a long time, and every footstep on the marble approach echoed twice in the high vaulted ceiling before fading, which gave the space a quality of weight that even the journalists in the gallery fell quiet for when they first entered it. He sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit without a tie, a choice he had made that morning in front of the mirror for reasons he did not explain to anyone, and the choice was in fact a specific deliberate echo. The suit without the tie being what Governor Whitfield had worn on Fairview Boulevard on the night everything changed. A quiet visual argument that the space between that night and this one was occupied by something that could be worn rather than performed. Behind him, in the gallery, Renee, in the burgundy dress she had bought for the night that Calloway had interrupted wearing it now for the occasion that night had been replaced by. Caleb, in his first suit jacket, sitting with his hands folded on his knees. Zara between her mother and Caleb, watching everything with the careful attention of a child who has decided that watching carefully is the thing she can do. 3 rows back, Carol Hensley, in the same cream jacket and dark slacks she had worn on her lawn, which was also a choice, also deliberate, also a form of statement that required no words. At the defense table, Brett Calloway sat in a prison-issue suit that did not fit him correctly, the jacket pulling across the shoulders and sitting too loosely at the waist, the way clothes fit people who have lost weight. They did not choose to lose, and the physical transformation was complete enough that Marcus had to make a conscious effort to hold the image of this man alongside the image of the man who had leaned into his window with his belt buckle scraping the door trim, and the effort was not because the facts were unclear, but because something in Marcus resisted conflating the man who had done that with the diminished, frightened figure currently unable to hold his own posture. Judge Patricia Wynn presided. She was 58 years old, 16 years on the federal bench, a woman who had spent her career in the specific demanding work of applying law precisely enough that the precision itself was the justice without the performance of severity and without the compression of mercy into something smaller than it deserved to be. And she read the courtroom with the settled, unhurried attention of someone who has already done the reading and is now simply present for the record. Before Judge Wynn invited Marcus to speak, the federal prosecutor rose and said that the government wished to enter one final piece of evidence into the sentencing record, and he pressed a button on a laptop that was connected to the courtroom's audio system. And the room went very quiet, and then the audio from Renee's phone recording played through the speakers. The clarity of it was startling. The boulevard air, the hum of the Lexus engine, the flashlight crackling against the windowsill, and then Calloway's voice, entirely recognizable, speaking in the casual, offhand tone of someone who expects no consequences, saying the words that had been said on Fairview Boulevard 8 months earlier, about a vehicle like this, and an address like his, and a neighborhood like this, and what those things in combination simply did not add up to. The courtroom held its breath. In the gallery, an older woman in the 4th row pressed her hand flat against her chest, not dramatically, but with the involuntary physical response of someone who has heard those words before in a different context, directed at a different person, and the recognition of them played across her face with an intimacy that told the whole story. Carol Hensley sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the speakers as if she could still see the boulevard. And at the defense table, Brett Calloway sat with his eyes fixed on the surface of the table in front of him, and the muscles along his jaw worked in the way they work when a person is trying to contain something that does not want to be contained. And his breathing had changed in the way breathing changes when a person is hearing, in a federal courtroom in front of 200 people, the precise audio confirmation that what they did was exactly what everyone now knows it was. And his hands flat on the table were entirely still, which was the most visible indicator of the effort it was taking to keep everything else still. The audio ended. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Judge Wynn said, "Mr. Delvane, the court will hear your impact statement." Marcus stood. He buttoned his jacket, which took a single, unhurried motion, and he picked up the single sheet of paper from the desk in front of him, and he did not look at the judge first, or at the gallery, or at the cameras permitted in the room for the public record, and instead he turned and looked directly at Brett Calloway. Calloway looked at his hands. Marcus said, "Look at me." He did not raise his voice. He said it in the register of a man who has practiced absolute calm for so long that it has become indistinguishable from authority, the register his father had taught him, and that he had refined over 44 years of being a person who needed it to be available at all times. And Calloway raised his head. Marcus held his gaze for a long, quiet moment, long enough that the room understood that this was not a moment being rushed, and then he looked down at his single sheet of paper, and he began. He said, "On the night of October 14th, you ran the plates on my vehicle before you activated your lights, and what came back was a clean record registered to a Marcus Delvane at an Oak Park address, and you hit the lights anyway because the information that mattered to you was not in the plate return but in the combination of variables you were looking at through your windshield, which was a new Lexus SUV and a black driver on a boulevard, where in your calculation those two things in combination required an explanation that the plate return did not provide." He paused and took a breath. He said, "And then you leaned into my window and you said it, and the courtroom just heard it, and every person in this room will carry those words the way certain words stay with you. Not because they are rare, but because they are not. Because every person in this room over a certain age has heard words exactly like them before, directed at someone they love, or directed at themselves, and what made tonight different? The only thing that made tonight different from every other night. Those words were spoken on every other street in this country, was that tonight there was a recording." He said it in the tone of a man for whom that last sentence is not a victory but a weight. He said, "You put handcuffs on me in front of my children, and the sound of those cuffs ratcheting onto my wrists is something my 8-year-old daughter heard from 2 feet away. And she is 8 years old, and she has been in therapy for 6 months working on what that sound did to her. Understanding of whether the world is safe, and she is making progress, real progress. Her therapist says so, but she will be making that progress for years, and it will be hers to carry in ways that I am not able to carry for her. And that is the specific, irreversible cost of what you did that night that no sentence in this room will fully address." He said, "My son is 11 years old, and he looked at me through the window of my own car while I was pressed against it in handcuffs, and I looked back at him. And the thing I saw on his face in that moment was not fear, or not only fear, but the specific expression of a child encountering a fact about the world that he had been told about but had hoped in the way that children hope was not actually real, and the expression on his face told me that the hope was over." He looked up. He said, "But the thing that haunts me, the thing I wake up thinking about at 3 in the morning, when the rest of it has settled into its proper place, is not what happened to my family on that street, because my family had resources that most families do not have. We had recordings and legal counsel, and a governor who happened to be hosting our dinner 3 blocks up the road, and we had the financial and professional standing to survive what you tried to do to us." He said, "What haunts me is the 38 names in your internal affairs file. The 38 people who sat exactly where I sat in the back of your cruiser and who filled out complaint forms and submitted them to a process they were told existed for them, and that process returned dismissal letters in 48 hours, and none of them had a governor drive by, and none of them had Carol Hensley on the lawn, and none of them had the recordings that made the difference. And the question of what happened to those 38 people after the dismissal letters arrived, the question of what it does to a person to write down exactly what happened to them and have the institution receive it and discard it, as if it were nothing, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer, and that I am asking you to hold in this courtroom today alongside the specific charges in front of you. He said, I am not here for revenge. I am here because there are 38 people whose names are in a file in a federal evidence room, and every year of every sentence you receive is not just yours to carry. It is the public statement that their accounts were true, that what they wrote down happened, that the machine that dismissed their complaints was wrong, that this court sees them even if the department never did. He stepped away from the podium. The ventilation system hummed. Someone in the gallery coughed once softly, and then there was nothing. Judge Wynn looked at Marcus for a long moment after he sat down, and then she looked at her papers, and then she looked at Calloway, and her expression was the specific final expression of a woman closing a file that has been open far too long. Judge Patricia Wynn did not pause before she began, and the absence of the pause communicated something that all the language that followed was simply elaboration. She had been ready for this for 8 months, and she was not going to perform hesitation for an audience. She named the charges one by one, and the naming was not perfunctory, but deliberate, each charge receiving the specific weight of the particular dismissed complaint it had replaced, as if the judge were doing for the record what Pryor's machine had been designed to prevent acknowledging each act of harm in the specific individual way that form letters were designed to avoid. Deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, fabrication of probable cause, witness tampering in the person of Carol Hensley, civil rights conspiracy in coordination with Captain Dennis Pryor and union leadership representing a pattern of conduct extending 11 years 38 documented incidents, and the deliberate institutional suppression of every complaint that would have ended that pattern earlier. She addressed Calloway directly, and her voice did not modulate toward the dramatic, because she understood that the dramatic register is what people use when they are not certain the facts are sufficient, and she was certain the facts were sufficient. She said you took an oath, and the oath was not a bureaucratic formality, but a specific named commitment to the people whose safety and dignity your badge was supposed to represent. And you spent 11 years using that badge in the precise inversion of that commitment, using it as a tool to select, target, and degrade people based on a conviction you carried without examination and exercised without consequence until the night that its consequences became impossible to contain. Calloway's attorney began to rise. Wynn raised one hand, did not look at him, and he sat back down. She said, I have read the file of 38 complaints. I have read every dismissal letter. I have read the names of the people who wrote down what happened to them and received form letters in return. This sentence is for them as much as it is for the record. She struck the gavel. Brett Calloway was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Permanent lifetime bar from law enforcement, private security, or any position of government authority at any level for the remainder of his life. And forfeiture of full pension, the amount of $318,000 redirected by court order to a civil rights legal fund, established in the names of the 38 complainants in his internal affairs file, so that the money that was supposed to represent his service would instead represent the acknowledgement that his service had in fact been a harm. The marshals came forward. They moved to Calloway from behind, and he stood without being asked, and they turned him around, and the steel handcuffs went onto his wrists with the same ratchet sound, the same mechanical click that Marcus Delvane had heard in the dark on Fairview Boulevard, while his daughter screamed and his son went silent. The exact same sound, the same model of restraint now on the wrists of the man who had put them there. And the symmetry of it did not require narration because every person in that courtroom heard it and understood it at the same moment. Marcus did not watch Calloway leave. He turned around. Renee was already looking at him, and Caleb had his arm around Zara, and Carol Hensley, 3 rows back, had her hand pressed to her mouth, and the gallery exhaled, and Marcus looked at his family and said nothing at all, because everything that needed to be said had been said in a courtroom while a recording played, and 38 names sat in a federal evidence room waiting to be read. Brett Calloway entered federal corrections on a gray Wednesday morning in February, transferred in a standard transport vehicle with standard restraints to a facility 4 hours from the city where he had spent 11 years deciding who belonged where, and he arrived wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, his wrists bound in the same model of steel restraints that had left marks on Marcus Delvane's skin that took 3 weeks to fully fade. His pension was forfeited in full $318,000, redirected by court order to the fund bearing the names of his 38 documented victims. His union local was dissolved under federal consent decree 6 weeks after sentencing. His wife filed for divorce the day the verdict was read. He would be 53 years old at his first eligibility review, and even then, no badge, no radio, no government-issued authority of any kind for the rest of his life. Governor Whitfield signed the Delvane Act into state law 4 months after the sentencing, a bill that eliminated qualified immunity for officers with documented patterns of civil rights violations, mandated independent civilian oversight boards with genuine subpoena power, and made it a felony for union officials to suppress or dismiss excessive force complaints without documented review. 14 states introduced identical legislation within the year. Captain Dennis Pryor accepted a plea on 3 counts of civil rights conspiracy and served 18 months. Frank Harlan was convicted on 2 counts of witness tampering and 1 count of federal racketeering, sentenced to 4 years. The 42nd Precinct was rebuilt from the ground up under a federal consent decree with a new chief, new accountability architecture, and 38 complaint files that had been dismissed in 48 hours reopened for formal review. On a warm Saturday in October, Marcus Delvane stood at the railing of the completed coastal revitalization project, the structure he had designed down to the last bolt now open to the public and full of families and children, and the specific ordinary noise of people using something beautiful for the purposes it was built for. At an information board on the pier, Caleb was pointing at the structural schematics, explaining the load-bearing design to a friend in the focused, proprietary way of a boy who has decided what he is going to be. Zara was already at the water's edge, shoes off, feet in the surf, completely unafraid of anything. Renee came up beside Marcus and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and watched his children and did not say anything at all, because everything that needed to be said had been said in a courtroom 8 months ago. And what was left was simply this: if this story moved you, if you felt the weight of that night on Fairview Boulevard and the long road to that courtroom, please take a second and hit that like button. Right now, it genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to know what happened to a retired Marine who came home from overseas to find a developer had seized his family land while he was deployed, a story with an ending nobody saw coming, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. What would you have done in Marcus's position sitting in the back of that cruiser watching through the glass? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. We will see you in the next one.